Hello, and welcome to the Baby I Can podcast. I'm your host, Debbie Weiss, and today we're going to talk about something that is universal. I don't think that you can get through life without dealing with grief. And here's the thing. Most people think grief begins when someone dies, but grief often begins much earlier. We can grieve lost dreams, lost expectations, changing relationships, altered futures, and versions of people we loved before they were ever gone. It's not something that we get over. We don't get over grief. It's something we learn to carry, and it evolves while we continue to live. When most people hear the word grief, they think about death, and it makes sense. But what are other forms of grief that maybe you don't think about as grief? Like divorce or illness, retirement, friendship changes, caregiving, empty nesting, job loss. I think I might have stumbled on that because it's a personal issue going on right now, and major life transitions. Grief is an emotional response that we as humans have to loss, and loss takes many forms. Looking back on my own life, I've realized some of my deepest grief happened long before anyone died. Boy, I can think of so many different examples, so many personal examples, but let me share the story of my oldest son's diagnosis. I struggled with infertility for many years, and I was lucky enough to give birth to Sam, my oldest, when I was 37 years old. It was the best day of my life, tied when I gave birth to my second son, Ben. But for now, we're focusing on Sam. And if you're a parent, you know you have all of these dreams and expectations for your children, and you envision them living this amazing life, and you want to give them everything under the sun so that they have every possible advantage. And just the thought of them suffering, I mean, it's like when you have to bring them back to the pediatrician when they're infants and they're going to give them all these injections at the same time. Oh my goodness, I remember I couldn't handle it. My husband and I took Sam together, but I was chicken and I left the room because I couldn't stand the thought of watching him suffer like that. It was physically painful for me. And as parents, I think that's how we feel. And I can see how that never goes away. I mean, my kids are 25 and 23, and oh my gosh, I want to do everything to help them and to not see them suffer. And now I really understand what it means when my parents used to say to me, oh, if only I could take that on for myself, take that pain so that you wouldn't have to experience it. And now I see, even at this stage of my life, how my mother is still worried about me. As they say, it doesn't matter how old you are or how old your children are. They're always going to be your children. So when Sam was 2, he was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And let me tell you, what a blow. Sam was still alive, thank God. I know many people have to deal with that unimaginable grief. And I did not lose him. And he was healthy and is healthy. And I still had my son. But I lost on that day when they handed me that pamphlet and said he is on the autism spectrum. Good luck to you. I lost the future that I thought that he would have. I lost the certainty and the expectation of raising a child who would just hit those milestones and have friends and not struggle with socializing and playing appropriately. And here I am, I can't even I can't even communicate correctly because just thinking back to that moment, it I was confused. I was so scared. What would his life look like? Would he be quote unquote normal? Would he ever have friends? Would he ever play sports? Would he ever go to college? Would he ever hold a job, get married? Like all of the things that we think about in raising our children. And I had absolutely no idea what life had in store for any of us. And look, we never do, right? But we do have some semblance of a certainty that, okay, the kids will go to school and they'll make friends and they'll do their homework and just the regular stuff, right? That we really take for granted. And in that moment, all of that was gone. Now, maybe for you, it's a similar diagnosis or something else. Infertility. I mean, I've got to say, I was extremely lucky that eventually I was able to have Sam and Ben. But I know what it felt like. I was the worst. It was just so hard. So I get that. How about divorce? You grieving the divorce, the breakdown of one of the most important relationships in your life. You're grieving your future life with that partner that you thought that you were going to have. Maybe it's a job loss, right? I mean, so many people, there's so many stories nowadays for a variety of reasons that companies are letting people go. I'm experiencing something kind of similar where I am an insurance agent and my company, after 31 years, just announced that they're changing the pay structure. And there's a good chance that I could lose 40% of my income. And even though right now they're not me, the terms of the contract have changed where within the previous terms, unless I lied, cheated, or stole something, I couldn't lose my job. And now that's not the case. I could get 30 days notice and they could say, you're gone. I've lost security. I've lost security of having my job. I've lost security of my income. And at this stage of my life, it's not what I expected. And I'm grieving. And I'm grieving the loss of the company that I once knew that is no longer exists in the same way. You could also be grieving a dream that never happened. Sometimes grief begins when life stops looking the way we thought it would, right? And I don't think that we think about that as grief. I feel like we think about that as disappointment, and it is disappointment, but there is grief involved. And then there's another kind of grief that maybe you're familiar with called anticipatory grief, which is grieving before you say goodbye. I started grieving my husband the minute that he and I sat in our kitchen looking at the computer screen at the oncologist who told us, Gary, you have terminal blood cancer. And for some, there's a possible cure, but for you, that isn't. And in that moment, I knew that my life, his life, my kid's life, it'll never be the same. And while we went through that struggle together in different ways, while I was caring for him and scheduling appointments and trying to stay optimistic and studying his blood work like I was a doctor and trying to stay strong for him, for the kids, for everybody. On the inside, I was grieving and I remember thinking, what's it going to feel like? What's it going to feel like when he really is gone? And I think that I was almost thinking, it's almost like when you're worrying and you think to yourself, well, if I think all the possibilities through and I kind of get myself familiar with what that feels like, when it actually happens, it won't be so bad. I can tell you firsthand, not the case at all. And I had the same thing with my father and my stepfather. With my father and my stepfather, knew that it was coming to the end. And it was different than with Gary, my husband. I knew it was coming and I just wanted to be there for them. I couldn't really imagine a world that they weren't in. And I started missing them before they were gone. Grief arrives before the goodbye very often. I mean, I think it happens with aging parents. As we all get older, we all know that the possibility is more likely that we're going to die. And so we're trying to get used to the idea of what will that feel like. I've seen it if you have a loved one who has dementia, even though they're physically there and maybe they're physically healthy, you see their mind going and you're grieving the person that you once knew. Terminal illness, as I already discussed, or even major life transitions. You're getting divorced. You're becoming an empty nester. You're grieving before it happens because you want to prepare yourself. One of the hardest things I've learned is that sometimes we do grieve people who are still alive. Thinking also about Gary, before cancer, there was mental illness. And so even though he didn't have dementia, I kind of think the two are similar in the sense that I watched as one by one, I was losing pieces of the husband that I knew. I was grieving the relationship that we once had, the partnership that we had, the laughter, the fun, the everything, the person he used to be was slipping away before my eyes, and I didn't understand it because at that point, I didn't really understand mental illness. I didn't understand any of it, and I just kept thinking that if I did something differently, took him to a different doctor, he took a different medication, if something changed, if I could make something easier, I would get him back. And I just kept trying. Each time I saw it didn't have an effect and things just seemed to get worse. And I was grieving him while he was still here. Same thing, very similar that happened when my father had a stroke and I was 17. I lost the father I knew. My father survived, thankfully. He lived for 30 years after his stroke. But my daddy was gone. He was still there, but he wasn't there in the same way. And instead of him being there to help me as I moved into young adulthood, the tables were turned, and I was the one who had to take care of him. Our whole relationship changed, and I never expected that to happen because he was my biggest champion. And the future that I imagined moving forward in my life completely changed. And then I'm going to share something that I really haven't shared too much, is a friendship, a very special friendship. I'm not going to use names, but I had a best friend we met when we were in 7th grade. And I think it's one of those opposites attract kind of thing. And we've been through life together, right? Ups and downs, and we've had some little fallouts, and we've had some time in our lives where maybe we were at different stages of our lives and we didn't see or talk to each other as much as we had in the past. And then somehow it would always come back around again. And probably for, I would say 15 years before Gary died, We were close as ever. And now I'm talking about since I was 12 years old. When Gary died, I was 59. So what's that? 47 years worth of friendship? And it's a long story, but right after Gary died, we had a falling out. I was devastated. First, I was mad because I was party to the falling out and definitely caused it. I am not placing blame. I think it, as always, came from both sides. And after Gary died, the fact that I was having this falling out with my best friend, and even though she thankfully was alive, I had lost her. I had lost the friendship. And I kept trying to attempt to repair things. And she was very kind with the text. She was never nasty. And there was always something that made me think, well, maybe she just needs a little time. After the first few months, when I was really trying to patch things up and I saw it wasn't happening and the texts got fewer apart, but I never could stop thinking about it. I was grieving this friendship so incredibly much. I couldn't get her or the whole situation out of my mind. I just wanted her back. And about 6 months ago, we had a text exchange and I asked her point blank, and she was very kind, but made it very clear that she thought what was best was for each of us to go our own ways. And I think that it was the first time that she said that very bluntly, which is what I needed to hear. And she did me a favor because even though I'm not happy about it, I finally had to come to terms with it. And peace eventually came. Because sometimes people in our lives are there for a season, even when that season is 47 years, a very long season. And one of the hardest forms of grief is grieving someone who's still alive, but no longer available to you in the same way. I still think about her, but not as much. And I don't have the expectation that things are going to change. I've just kind of accepted that we were friends for a season, and that's all that was meant to be. Most people think grief after death is about missing the person. And it is. It absolutely is. But it's also about missing other things. The routines that you share together, the companionship, the conversation, the shared history, right? When Gary died, I wasn't only grieving Gary, I was grieving future anniversaries, trips, growing old together, retirement. You know what I also have come to realize? I'm also grieving, sharing the joys and the heartache of parenthood, because nobody else can understand how you feel about what's happening in your kid's life other than your spouse or your partner or their parent, your co-parent, right? Whether you're divorced or not. And now that was gone. I had no one to share my future with, no one to share the joys and heartbreak of parenthood. There's other kinds of grief that we really don't recognize. Think about becoming an empty nester. I mean, everybody's fine, but life is different. Oh my goodness, when Ben first went off to school, even though I still had Sam here and Gary was alive at the time, it was the most bizarre thing. I felt like someone cut off my arm and took it somewhere. And it was out in the world, and he wasn't here under my roof, and I couldn't stand it. I can't even imagine what it would feel like for both of them to be gone. And then there's retirement grief. How often do you hear that people lose their identity? So many of us, our identities are tied to what we do. Not only that, you lose the structure. Maybe nobody likes to get up when the alarm goes off, but at least your days have structure and they also have purpose. You have to figure out when you retire how to incorporate those things back into your life in an enjoyable way. It's not going to look the same. And for many people, it takes a long time and they never really enjoy retirement. And then, of course, there's health grief. Your body changes, your abilities change. You may be experiencing some of this right now. And I have to say that I am too. I've had a lot of, I was going to say structural problems, but I don't know what the medical term is. I've had my hips replaced and I've had a spinal fusion, and I had that about 27 years ago now. And since my hip replacement's about 14 years ago, I think the last one was, I have been great. I've been able to do pretty much what I want with some limitations. And out of the blue, maybe about 4 months ago, my body rebelled, and now I seem to be having troubles with both my cervical and lumbar spine that might require surgery. And I'm grieving my health because right now I don't have it. And look, you could be sitting there listening, thinking, look, Deb, be quiet. At least you are not dealing with some terrible disease like cancer, like dementia. And you're absolutely right. I've learned that you shouldn't measure your grief against someone else's because it's so easy to do. How many times do you have something happen and then someone will say, well, look, you have no reason to feel sorry for yourself. You have a roof over your head and you have some money, and look at that homeless person out there. And that's true. But that doesn't take away from how I feel and how you feel. Grief is personal, and we should each be able to experience it and not compare ourselves to someone else. Then, of course, there's caregiver grief, losing the role that consumed your life. I mean, it seems crazy because being a family caregiver is so difficult. And when it ends, either because hopefully your loved one gets better, or if they pass away, you'd think that you should be happy to be free, so to speak. But you're not, because now this has become your identity and what you know, and it's taken over your life. And now you've got to figure out, where do I go from here? And of course, the friendship grief. And sometimes it's not a big blow up. It could be just growing apart or drifting or life changing. Not all grief comes with a funeral. So what makes grief so hard? Well, people want grief to move faster. Oh, when's it going to be over? So many people too, they want to stay private. They don't want to share their grief. They're not comfortable with that. And they want grief to follow a timeline. All right, well, now it's been a year. We just want grief to be finished. But grief doesn't always work that way. And it can revisit us at the most random times. Now, of course, we think on holidays or birthdays or anniversaries, but it's so much more than that. I find that grief hits me at the strangest times. It's hearing something that reminds me of the person. It makes me smile, but it also makes me hurt as well. It doesn't disappear. I know grief never disappears. It just changes. So, what can help us carry grief? You know, I'm going to tell you to name it, be aware of it. Sometimes we can't heal when we don't acknowledge what's really happening. And remember, like I just said, your grief is valid. Stop comparing yourself to somebody else. It's valid even if someone else has it worse. And you know what? You're always going to find someone who has it worse and someone who has it better. And then there's that whole feeling of mixed emotions. And now I can't remember the term, but I remember actually when Sam was doing some kind of social pragmatic language thing, it's when you feel two feelings at the same time. How can you feel joy and sadness? How can you be grateful and angry simultaneously? It happens. We don't just, oh, well, right now I am happy. And in the next 15 minutes, I will be sad. It just doesn't work like we're allowed to feel all the feelings. We need to stop asking, when will it be over? Nope, it's not going to be over. But maybe you just need to think about, is there a different way that I can carry this or deal with this in a way that might be healthier for me? You got to keep living. It's hard, but if we just stay stuck and we don't move on and we don't move forward, it's no good. Is that what your loved one would want for you? Of course not. I'm not talking about right after losing a loved one or losing, as we talked about, a job, a friendship, becoming an empty nester. No, you got to feel all the feels. But then at a certain point, you can still feel it and move on with your life. So here's what I want you to think about this week. What loss am I still carrying? What grief have I never acknowledged? Maybe the things I've talked about are making you look at grief a little bit differently and broaden your definition of it. Am I grieving a person, a dream, a relationship, a certain type of future? Or maybe it's a version of yourself that you're grieving. And what would it look like to honor that loss? This week, I want you to identify one grief you've never fully acknowledged. Give it a name, write about it, talk about it, and stop pretending that it's not there. One of the things grief has taught me is that loss is part of being human. The deeper we love, the more vulnerable we become to grief. But grief isn't evidence that you're broken. It's evidence that something mattered. Grief is the price we pay for loving deeply, and that makes it one of the most human experiences we will ever have. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back here next week.